and if you read some of the history of the founders and framers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they were tough, long hours, and they were hot. So this is like Philadelphia in 1775, 1776. And, think about it, no air conditioning. So how did they relax at night? Get rid of some of the steam, the pressure. Went to the tavern, had a cold draft beer, and they authored two incredible documents, the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. Our facilitator for tonight is none other than Lieutenant General Jim Dubick. I consider Jim Dubick a mentor, a colleague, and a great friend. He is the co-chair of the War, Peace, and Justice Project, along with the other co-chair, which is General Sir Rupert Smith of the United Kingdom. Of course, he's not here tonight. Of course, there's probably a little reason for that since we're celebrating Independence Day. A little bit about General Jim Dubick. General Jim Dubick has a storied career over 37 years of active duty service. He was the Omar Bradley strategy chair here in Carlisle. And at that time, it was shared by Dickinson College, Penn State Dickinson Law, and the U.S. Army War College. And the War, Peace, and Justice Project is partnered with Dickinson College, Penn State Dickinson Law, and also the Cumberland County Historical Society. And we value their partnership and their great support they've given us since really the founding in 2019 and disrupted by COVID. General Dubick has served in many roles in every unit imaginable, from the platoon level all the way up to the corps level. So it's amazing service that he has performed for our nation. He's also the author of Just War Reconsidered, Strategy, Ethics, and Theory, which many of the war colleges have used in their curriculum. It's one of the finest books based on the strategic level of just war tradition. So if you're a veteran out there or military, or if you're just interested in military history, it's a wonderful book. With that said, I think General Dubick, I think if you would join the podium and welcome tonight. Thank you very much for being here. Before I introduce one gentleman from New York who has arrived on horse, and the other one from Virginia on horse, I do need to say, I was remiss earlier today talking about the core founder of the War, Peace, and Justice Project, and that's Sherwood McGinnis, who we named the War Project after him. Sherwood is here with us tonight. His presence is always with us in every program we do, and if it wasn't for him, we would not be here tonight. And he was a career Foreign Service officer. He died prematurely. It's be 5 years this year. And we miss him dearly, but he's left a great legacy with the War, Peace, and Justice Project. Today is 3 July, and of course it's hot. Tomorrow we celebrate the nation's birthday, but yesterday was 2 July, and I'd like to do a reading. But this reading comes from 1776, on the 2nd of July. And they're titled General Orders, and they're from General George Washington, who's in New York. And these are basically instructions to the Army at the time and to his general officers. So I'd just like to read a paragraph. The time is now near at hand, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be freemen or slaves, whether they are to have any property they can call their own, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and they consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will probably deliver them. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. Our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us no choice but a brave resistance or the most abject submission. This is all we can expect. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die. Our own country's honor all call upon us for a vigorous and manly exertion. And if we now shamefully fail, we shall become infamous to the whole world. Let us therefore rely upon the goodness or the cause of the cause and the aid of the Supreme Being, in whose hands victory is, to animate and encourage us to great and noble actions. The eyes of all our countrymen are now upon us, and we shall have their blessings and praises, if happily we are the instruments of saving them from the tyranny mediated against them. Let us therefore animate and encourage each other and shew the whole world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any Slavish mercenary on earth. It is the 3rd of July. Is it 2026 or is it 1776? Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce two patriots who will join our other patriot, General Jim Dubick. One has traveled from New York, all the way from New York, and the other from the colony of Virginia. Without any further ado, gentlemen, I'd like to introduce General George Washington and patriot Patrick Henry.
Well, good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here in the tavern. You don't know this, but I'll say, we're celebrating our 250th anniversary of the work that you had done in the 1770s and 80s.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. Made it this far, and you might be surprised to know that we call you, your leaders, the founding generation. So I'm going to ask some questions of you, each individually or both, that are on our mind now, 250 years later. We'd like to hear from the founding generation.
Absolutely. Our absolute pleasure. Well, my pleasure. Maybe not Mr. Henry's.
But you say 250 years.
Yes.
Here, watch this slow.
Where has the time gone?
It goes in one direction and it never stops.
But thank you.
I feel very good for my age.
Look, from our perspective, the movement, the revolutionary movement was about 60 years long, 1760 and 1790. And we use that block of time because that's the movement from us as subjects to a king to citizens of a democratic republic. And so I wondered from your perspective now, how you thought about this movement from subject to citizen, and whether this movement mattered with your deliberations in the Constitution writing and ratification.
Well, I mean, I think it played a significant part in it. And I should say, not play a significant part. The transition from subject to citizen is I think one could argue is a fascinating one. Mr. Henry, if I may briefly speak on your behalf and my own, we both grew up in a world, in a time, though separated in age somewhat. We grew up in a time where there was no true distinction between the two. There was no great recognition that subject and citizen in the Empire of Great Britain had much of a distinction. You were a subject of the king and a citizen of the empire. So when you think of, when I was a child growing up, I never would have, I know I didn't think of what it would be like to be part of a different system of government. Now, I was trained and had ingrained in me from a very young age by my mother and my father before he passed, what little I remember, my brothers and my patrons, the Fairfaxes, that this concept of loyalty to the crown was a essential aspect of my responsibility as a Virginian, first and foremost, but secondly, a member of the British Empire. Obligation, responsibility, and care for one's family, obviously, one's country, Virginia, and one's king, at that time, George II, eventually his grandson, George III. So everything I was trained in as a young man was with that basic principle. When I took oaths to serve first as the militia adjutant, then as a major at the militia, then as a lieutenant colonel in what became later the provincial forces of Virginia, the Virginia Regiment, different than militia, but military. I'm sorry, I'll go to a tangent that you don't care much about. And then eventually as colonel of the Virginia Regiment, and then eventually as a member of the House of Burgesses, our own elected representative body. Those oaths that I was swearing were all to the crown, to support His Majesty the King, to uphold his lands and his protection, to protect his people as he protects us, and to owe that liege loyalty to him. And so everything in my life, from whether it's serving as a magistrate, which I have done, whether it is serving as a member of the vestry in my local parish for the Church of England, but even that too was sort of dedicated to the crown. You know, the king is the head of the Church of England, and therefore any service done to the church is by proxy serving the king. So this concept of subject for me in particular is when it is mixed in with my very upbringing. So to transition from subject of the king to not subject. And one would argue a very rapid transition. We can go into more detail as time goes on. I'm sure if other conversation will naturally spawn this, but I transitioned from loyal subject of the crown to, according to the crown, a disloyal traitor in the course of about a year and a half. Now, was there a long build to this? A long, slow build? Absolutely. But the actual transition from I am serving to the attempt to maintain loyalty to the crown to I am now at an abject treason against said crown and whatever may, well, at least the king's perspective on it eventually, but that's part of the ministry. What happens next really remains to be seen. And so as we have now transitioned now into this new system of government, which has been a very smooth, simple process. If you believe that, I'll tell you another. There's been in and of itself a process longer than, well, one might argue, as long as our War of Independence. We fought for 8 years, and then from the time the question of argument of what government would establish, which began about a year into our military endeavors in 76, that's when the Declaration was instituted. And then we did not have the Articles of Confederation, our first some semblance of government, which was I should say some semblance of confederation amongst the states, until a few years later, and it was not ratified until close to the end of the war. And then we had another few years, and then the constitutional question came up in 86, 87, 88, and we did not start a new government officially until 89. So nearly, in fact, one could argue the War for Independence lasted less time than the actual creation of a system of government that eventually established what you know as the United States. So, ironically enough, the transition from citizen citizen of no country to citizen of a country was actually longer than the transition from subject to citizen for myself. So it's a very essential part. Without understanding that process, individually, corporately, state by state, as a corporate whole, one cannot quite grasp, I think, the importance of why we separated and turned into citizens of a different system of government rather than continuing loyalty so ingrained in us from our childhood.
You say that you went from being a citizen to a traitor in the span of about 1.5 years.
About a year and a half.
I appear to have gotten an earlier start.
You did, I think.
I was first accused of treason when I was but 30 years old.
I remember it very well.
And it appears to have been a path that worked for me because I was accused of treason again 2 years later. And then in 1755, I was branded an outlaw. So you might wish to be careful about the company you keep this evening. And so I just want to advise you, yes, but we were indeed raised in a colony that was most loyal to the crown. As a child, I couldn't imagine life being any different.
Mhm.
But then, I was a child. I had freedom. I had the things that I need. I had an education. I was taught by my father, who was an educated man, attended college in Scotland. Was also taught by my uncle, who was an Anglican minister. His name was Patrick. I received my name after him. He was also educated in Scotland, both at King's College. So we had that tradition of education with us, and I was taught that from a very early age. My father tutored me. He taught me math, some Greek, Latin, ancient and modern history. My uncle taught me about the church. So I had these various traditions that were handed to me. But I was also highly influenced by my mother. She was not a member of the Church of England. She was a dissenter. Her family was persecuted by the Anglican Church, representatives of the crown. So I saw and experienced at a young age that there was something that was not right. And I've remembered that. But before we actually began the move from subject to citizen, our colonies existed for a period of about 150 years in a wonderful and relatively stable balance between the colonies, the Parliament, and the Crown. Having been the inheritors and the benefactors of the Magna Carta, the British Bill of Rights, and those other governing documents that came to control Great Britain, and as benefactors of that, we knew what was expected of us. We knew what we should do. But we also had the experience that having the system of government where we were ruled by the consent of ourselves, we elected representatives to our colonial assemblies. Now, granted, voting, suffrage was not universal. You had to be a property owner. But we elected representatives to our colonial assemblies. They enacted legislation and transacted the business of the colonies. They worked in cooperation with governors who were appointed by the crown and answered to the crown. Then our activities were documented and sent to England, where they were reviewed by the Parliament that had the responsibility for managing commerce, trade, the economy, and other affairs of state. Then their actions were reviewed by the Crown, who gave final approval or disapproval. That balance worked for nigh 150 years. And then we began to experience a change. And as we're talking about it, I think the change occurred in 4 stages. We did not move initially. The government of Great Britain moved, the Parliament and the Crown. They began to ignore their own laws. And then when we felt the effect of those changes, we as loyal subjects, as patriots of Great Britain, called on the Parliament, please go back to enacting the laws. Follow the laws that you impose on us. Follow the Constitution. Do not vary from it. So that was a move. They moved away. Our move was to call them back. We professed our loyalty, but please listen to us. We have rights. We have subjects. We have privileges. We are still subjects. We wish for things to be peaceful. But over a period of time, say beginning in 1760 with Navigation Acts were enacted by Parliament. Well, let's face it, Great Britain ruled the oceans. And all trade took place by way of maritime affairs. So that was a part of the commerce and the activity of Great Britain. And some people in the colonies kind of engaged in a type of self-employment called smuggling. So we'll just call it acquisitions. But those navigation acts were put in place to monitor and control smuggling. And then around 1760 or so, Parliament enacted what were called writs of assistance that enabled local governmental authorities to search anyone's home, anyone's property, even if there was a rumor that they were involved in smuggling. And a young attorney named James Otis in Massachusetts challenged that in court, claiming that this was a violation of British law. And I think that's where things started. And then in 1760, the general was not a general that time, but he was engaged in war, the French and Indian War. So he was busy in service to the crown on behalf of the crown and on behalf of our native Virginia. I was practicing law, so I was not a part of that. But the war concluded in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. We celebrated. Our nation won. The rival, France, was defeated. And no sooner did that war end than the dynamic changed between Great Britain and the colonies. The king issued a proclamation that prohibited migration west of the Allegheny Mountains. Those were lands that were part of our charters. The Ohio River Valley belonged to Virginia. Our veterans had been promised land there in return for their service. They were insulted. They felt betrayed. What did people do? Well, they moved in anyway. Then Great Britain kept a standing army. That was never acceptable to the British people. The British people had always feared standing armies in peacetime because they could be used by small-minded, egotistical men to achieve their own aims. And Britain had seen enough civil war to teach a very powerful lesson about that. And then we get to the matter of a series of taxes and other arbitrary decisions made by Parliament that played out over a period of a decade or more. And as we engaged in that move to ask Parliament to come back to following the law, and when they refused to do that, we were driven to defend our own selves, our own interests. And we began to engage in other activities.
So delicately put.
Yeah, so, and eventually, we prepared for a break with England. When there was no other option, it was freedom or slavery, live or die. And then we made the break. So that was the fourth one. We declared our own independence. But over that period of time, it happened slowly. And what we noticed, when people are upset about something, they'll talk, they'll gossip. Sometimes they express facts, sometimes they express rumor, but they're talking. And then when there's no action, they start to form groups. Have you ever done that? You get interested in something, either very excited or very upset. You say, I don't want to do something about it, so let's get a group going. And then you take some kind of action. You write letters, you petition, and if there are no positive results for your activity, you step it up. So you start to protest. Now, some protests are peaceful, and we learned that some were not. A lot of damage, a lot of violence, bloodshed. And as things deteriorated with England, the colonies started forming their own type of governments. So by the year 1774, British authority in the colonies was collapsing. The colonies took it on themselves to form their own provincial governments just to survive and just to figure out how do we move forward. And in that process, people participated either as representatives or they engaged in home manufacturers. They participated in boycotts. We were a significant part of Britain's economy. We heard we were responsible for about 1/3 of British commerce. We got very little in return. And so we figured if we don't import or export, that will hurt Britain's economy and they'll listen to us.
Which had worked before.
What's that?
Which had worked before.
It hadn't worked before. It got to where it didn't work so well. Then,
New York.
as we came under military threat from a British occupation army,
Mhm.
we formed committees of correspondence so we could share ideas and information back and forth, keep apprised of the affairs of Parliament, and keep a watchful eye on the activities of the British Army. Then we formed committees of safety. They actually functioned as more or less our government until we organized our individual state governments. They dealt with raising and training and dispatching militia. So these things happened. So there was this movement from the ground up. And I think the ability to demonstrate one's citizenship was innate in us. It was already a part of us because of the way we were raised. We were the benefactors of of great tradition.
Mhm.
The Constitution of England. And we didn't want to see it violated. It meant everything to us. But Britain moved and we had to respond. So I took a lot of time for that, I'm sorry.
But I'm sensing a little disconnection
Excellent.
between the two of you. Generally, you talked about a year and a half transition from subject to trader.
Mhm.
And Mr. Henry, you're talking about 15, 16, 17 years of movement from being a loyal subject to being treated as second-class subjects militarily. You're familiar with that, economically, politically, agriculturally. And that's a slow movement. You talked about a fast movement. What's the relationship here? Why do you think it's went a little faster than Mr. Henry?
I think in some ways you have just struck upon two things in my case. One, I'm very well known for keeping a division between my public and private thoughts. And so Mr. Henry, I think, has accurately described much of my private thoughts and his frustrations. What you hear as well in my commentary myself was much more my public stance on situations. And therein lies the complexity, for all humans have a great deal of uniqueness to them. The second piece of this is just that my experiences in Virginia are different than many people. My frustration with Parliament and the ministry is long and storied. In Virginia government, Mr. Henry knows I was not particularly fond of speaking in public in the House of Burgesses, but the handful of times that I did speak in public, I stood fairly firmly on the side of Virginia concern with the overreaches from Parliament. What I was more adept in doing, frankly, was operating behind the scenes in a very subtle way. I learned in my military campaigns that my youthful ignorance and ambitions and, frankly, temper got me into more trouble than I would like to admit.
Mhm.
We can talk about that some other time, or we can forget that I said it. When I entered into government, I spent the first 2 years sitting alongside men who were far more experienced, educated, and intelligent than I was, Mr. Henry being one of them. When you joined us, well, you joined us a few years later, so you didn't get to witness my first excellent years of saying absolutely nothing in government. And to the point of this, and this will play into your question, which I appreciate the direct reference between how long or how short this transition was. My first speech in the House of Burgesses went something like this. The Speaker of the House at the time, Sir Robinson, I began sitting in 59, resigned my military commission in 58. The war continued for a few more years. I was done with it. My health was not good. Got married. Was sitting in the House.
Health improved.
Health improved significantly after the war part was done, and the marriage helped a great deal. My lady was very delightful. She, without her, I would not be where I am today. I'd probably be dead in a ditch somewhere, to be honest. The first thing I said in the House of Burgesses, Mr. Robinson called upon me, said, Colonel Washington, we wish to thank you for your past military service and honor you, et cetera, for your long service to Virginia, which we all knew in the House of Burgesses is a complicated thing to say, because there were many in the House of Burgesses who did not think I did a good job at all, and most of them were right. Mr. Robinson thanked me, and I remember standing up and expected to say something in response. And I stood there just stuttering for about 10 seconds. And Mr. Robinson saved me from my own incompetence and said, "Mr. Washington, we know that your humility, et cetera, is a wonderful thing, and you are demonstrating it now by your inability to speak. Sit down, please, before you embarrass yourself." And I said nothing else for 2 years in the House. But what I did is I listened. I listened. I listened. I listened. I read. I listened. I read. I listened more. So by the time Mr. Henry joined us on the floor of the House, I was quite experienced and adept at understanding the complexity of our government and the questions, the core concepts of it. And what I began to see as we moved into this independence movement, I began to see in government the same patterns of behavior I had seen in the 7 Years' War. The British officer system, the British military structure, looking down upon and castigating and seeing as not as important provincial troops that were attached to whatever military forces engaging in conflict. And I mean in quite direct ways. Men being refused promotion, myself being one of them, true. Men being sent to die, men being ignored, resources and ammunitions not being given. I mean, the governor of Virginia at the time, not the lieutenant governor, the governor was the commander-in-chief of the military forces in North America. He arrived in New York and never even bothered to visit the colony of Virginia that he was the governor of and spent his entire time defending from that place, abandoned us completely to the frontier. So all these complexities led me to recognize that the British government, the British officers, I should say, did not consider provincial troops to be their equal. In fact, they considered them to be their inferior. So that was I could say, perhaps a stain upon my mind. But I kept this expectation of service. Remember, I said loyalty and oaths, that was ingrained in me. The concern about the British military was not that the king was involved in this. George II did not directly give these men orders. He did by way of other individuals. So my expectation, my belief was that the king, first and foremost, was caring for us as had been expected, though, as had always been the case, acting, as you said so eloquently in a conversation we had earlier, as a father to us. We are children of the king, and he is our father. That is the expectation. And that those who are his agents, perhaps, were not acting with proper care, these officers, not all of them, but enough. We move into government, and as these years continued, I maintained that loyalty to the crown. I said, I took an oath that with my life I would defend His Majesty's territories and his people. And if I did not break that, if I broke that oath, then my life was forfeit by simple existence of breaking the oath. So at the time we arrived to this period that Mr. Henry talks about, the political adjustments, I began to understand more of government and the basic principles, which we can discuss in more detail later, of British representative government and what representative government in the empire meant as the freest people in the world. 3 basic distinctions. People elect their representatives. Some complexity then. People have the ability to directly petition their representatives, as we speak to you now. And I mean all free people, regardless of whether you vote or not. Doesn't matter if you're a woman who owns a business, or your husband has passed away, or you're a free black Carter, or you're one of the Nottoway Indians who are part of the empire in the frontier or closer to the frontier. If you are a free member of English society, British society, you have the right to petition your government whether you vote or not. That's allows to protect those who cannot vote because of their legal complexities. And the third piece is that a government will not, once elected, representative government, will not pass laws that they exempt themselves from. If they do, they stop to be representative. I can say that again in case you missed it. A representative government, once established, will not pass laws that they exempt themselves from. What that means is if I, and we did this in the war, if we were to say, we're going to place a tax on you based on something, but I exempt myself from that legislation, from that tax. Well, I can't represent your interests because I've just said I'm in a better position than you, and I know better than you do, and you must now suffer under my burden. That's called tyranny. That's what that is. Blatant, abject tyranny. Those 3 principles were there, and I watched as the British government, again, the Parliament began to overstep those bounds and pass legislations one at a time that breached all things. We don't elect members of Parliament. No one in North America votes for members of Parliament. We do not have the ability to directly, as I speak to you now, petition members of Parliament. And 3, most of these laws they were passing that we were protesting were things that they exempted themselves and their own constituency in England from. They were legislations passed only on the colonies, which identified that they did not see us as equal to them. Now, you can argue all day long of the reasons of economics. The taxes were not that severe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a petty squabble between the aristocrats of the colonies and the aristocrats of England. You can argue that all day long, and I will not stand on your way. But at the end of the day, there are only 2 statuses in the British Empire. You are either free subjects of the empire, or you are not. That is the only distinction. You either have the same liberties guaranteed British government structure, the three that I mentioned to you effectively, and there's others, but those are the main ones, or you do not have them at all. A brief moment to make sure I clarify this. When I speak of voting in the year of 1770, 60, 1776, 1778, 1789, we do not consider voting a right or a liberty. It is an obligation. So if you have the franchise because you're either engaged in business, owning property, white male Protestant over the age of 21, this is Virginia, by the way, etc., and basically not Catholic. You have the vote. If you don't vote, you are fined 1/2 to 1/3 of your annual tax levy for every infraction. So think of it this way. Those who vote in Virginia, which is we're both from Virginia, they're all taxpayers. If you're not a taxpayer, they're not voting in our time. I'm not saying that is a good thing or an incorrect thing, because it disenfranchises many people. Women, for example, who own their own businesses, who are head of household, they aren't voting, and they're paying taxes for their business. So there's complexity. I'm not saying it's a perfect system. But that's why the second piece is there, to ensure that those women, those free black men, those natives, those individuals who do not vote but are still living in society have the right to petition their government. They're protected by it. By breaching all of these things in the 1760s, 1763, 1764, 1767, 1778, 1768, and so on, England began to prove that the Parliament now was thinking differently about us. So you ask, why did I shift from the loyal subject of the crown to traitor so quick? Well, because I'm not a subject of the Parliament. In my mind, I never was a parliamentary subject. They simply had an advisory capacity. We passed legislation to our own elected government. Parliament would look at it, and they would make a decision to a certain point. But at the end of the day, the king's ministry and the king are the ones who decided whether law in Virginia stayed or didn't. Our allegiance went directly to the crown. We are not Parliament's colony. People say the King's Colony of Virginia, the King's Colony of Massachusetts. Our charters are with the crown, not the English representative government. Our own governments are the representative government, agreed to in our charter with the king. So for me, the transition from loyal subject of the king to disloyal subject of the king was a very short period. My frustration with Parliament was a long-standing process. I had problems with Parliament and the ministry. Many problems, but until the king himself made his opinions known, I would not break my oath to him. And you will notice, I never publicly speak out against the crown until after the king proclaimed the colonies in rebellion and outside his protection. When that happened, he broke his oath to me, and therefore I'm no longer obligated by it.
May I elaborate on something, since you noticed that we had various departure dates for fealty to the crown. As I said a little while ago, I had family members persecuted by the Anglican Church. They were representatives of the crown. And when you look at the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, there are several articles in it. About 6 of them deal with loyalty to the crown as the head of the Church of England. And in Virginia, since the Anglican Church was the established church, citizens were required to attend services at least once a month and to pay a tax to support the church, to pay salaries, to raise money for the poor, to maintain church operations. And our economy was built on tobacco. Tobacco was money. We didn't have specie and coin lying around. It was tobacco.
The king would not allow us to have specie and coin lying around.
Right. Yeah. The currency. That'd be.
It was illegal to export gold and silver out of the empire to the colonies.
So we use tobacco as our currency, and when you are subject to the laws of nature and you are a planter, you may have good years, you may have bad years. But the Anglican ministers were paid an annual salary of 16,000 pounds of tobacco per year at whatever the market rate was. It tended to average about 2 pennies per pound. Now, there were years of drought in the mid 1750s, 1755, and again in 1758. Yeah, the harvest were loud, the harvest were poor. And if you're depending on harvest for your livelihood, and you're using tobacco as currency, you have less money just to take care of yourself and to support your family and to pay your obligations to the crown. The Virginia legislature, in its wisdom and compassion, saw the plight and felt the plight of the people, and they enacted what was called the Two-Penny Act. It was a temporary measure to last 9, maybe 10 months. It set the price of tobacco at 2 pennies per pound, and those who were required to pay their taxes could do so with tobacco or use specie or coin. The Anglican ministers went along with that in 1755. In 1758, they were not so pleased about a reduction in their salaries. They complained to England, and there the British Board of Trade declared the Virginia law null and void.
In the middle of a war, mind you.
In the midst of a war, and then it went to the king, who declared our law invalid. I was called into a court case after Anglican ministers started suing for back wages.
3 to 4 years, by the way.
Yes, it took a long time for this to run its course. So I was called in to replace an attorney who had represented the defendant, the parish tax collector. I could not overcome or overturn the previous judgment. I could only make a case as to how much money this particular Anglican minister should receive as compensation. So it was my first public court trial. It was not pretty. I got up, I stammered around, I stumbled, I seemed to have difficulty getting my footing. And there was a whole bunch of Anglican ministers there smirking. My father was the main judge. He was embarrassed. But after a while, I collected my thoughts, and then I turned my attention to the nature of compact law. The general said, you know, we are children of a father. The father is the king. The father has an obligation to care for his children. The children pledge loyalty in return. So in that court case, I argued about the nature of compact and this very relationship. And I said that the king, by nullifying a just and compassionate law to relieve the suffering and the hardship of his people, had devolved from being a father and had become a tyrant, and he no longer deserved our loyalty. People started murmuring treason. But then I called on the jury. You have to decide something. You have a choice. You can rivet chains on us, or you can support the just laws of the duly elected representatives of the colony of Virginia. The jury deliberated 5 minutes. They came back and awarded the Reverend 1 penny in damages. The men lifted me upon their shoulders and carried me out into the courtyard, and they cheered. I was reported to England. Some of the Anglican clergy complained that the Virginia legislature had all committed treason. But I turned my attention against them and said, you were supposed to be shepherds of these people. You betrayed your obligation. We don't need you either. But I won the case. And admittedly, I needed to build my reputation as a lawyer. But what happened, I gained the attention of people because they said, this man can voice our concerns. I didn't come to this overnight. The general and I did not attend college. We are self-educated men. That gives us something in common we did not have with our other founders, as you call us. So we learned in different schools.
We're both practical men too.
So,
I'm hearing 2 dimensions, excuse me. Two dimensions to your argument, a negative dimension and a positive dimension. You spend a lot of time talking about what's wrong, how things went wrong, why things went wrong with the relationship between the colonists and subjects and Parliament and the king. Your generation rejected that. understandably so, and we're glad of it. But you had to replace it with something. There's a positive dimension to this. How did you redefine citizenship in the arguments you were having leading up to the rejection of the Articles of Confederation and the development of the Constitution? What's the role of government that you envisioned, and what was the relationship between the government and its citizens?
I think Mr. Henry probably has a better perspective on some of these pieces in that he was actively involved in a lot of this establishment. Quickly after the war, my part in the conflict is very simple, not even a negative aspect, but a complicated one. My job in this entire process from 1775 onward was no longer as a politician. I was engaged in service to Virginia. I served in the House of Burgesses. I was elected to the first and second Congress. I served in those capacities on behalf of Virginia. But as soon as the Congress decided to appoint me commander-in-chief of all the Continental Army, my role immediately shifted to one that I was very familiar with, which was running a military. Not that I was always good at it in the initial days, but I learned a great deal in that war, and I learned a great deal within those intervening years. So my job went from being a member who established law and helped keep to it, to being an individual who enforced whatever those established laws would be. So as a member of this army, as Continental Army Commander-in-Chief, I recognized the important distinction that I'd always struggled with previously, but I would hold to very, very firmly, is that as the commander, I answered first and foremost to civilian authority. And for my part, that is the first thing I envisioned, is that as the military officer in charge of these pieces, my better, and the one I gained instructions from and operated on behalf of, was the Congress, which, by the way, in those days had no legal authority whatsoever. It was an advisory committee of various separate countries, effectively, well, not effectively, actually, separate countries, who were all agreeing to sort of kind of talk about things and maybe do the same thing at the same time. And that was basically the establishment of the early Continental Congress. So my operational authority was a group of people who all hated each other and didn't get along. And sometimes would work together and sometimes wouldn't. And so throughout the entire 8 years of war, I witnessed time and time and time again the incompetence of Congress as better men like Jefferson, I say that with some tongue in my cheek, not then later, and men like John Adams and others who went home to their respective states and began establishing their own state governments. Mr. Henry was involved in this. They did the work that needed to be done. The states needed to create their own systems of government. The Congress then, unfortunately, ended up with individuals who were not as well-liked or well-known in the States, who then were sort of stuck in this in-between period. So we were trying to, for my part, what I watched was the struggle of this Congress without proper authority, who needed to have proper authority, try to navigate their way through a conflict, and at times did not know what to do. Made appointments based upon popularity as opposed to execution, made appointments based upon individuals who someone liked better. It was just a constant struggle to properly supply and support the army time and time again. Not to castigate the members of Congress, they had a difficult job to do. But I was watching as a member who was upholding their authority, and I found my hands tied time and time again. But the thing that I held to was it was not my job to break those bounds. The ties placed upon me were ties that I would submit to, because I would not be like, say, Caesar, who took the power, became dictator, and then refused to yield it back to the empire, or to the republic in those days. I wish to make sure that I set an example, not just for myself, but for my men, that we would create something new, as imperfect as it might be, and that it was time for the politicians to figure out what that was supposed to be at home. Our job was to make sure they had the time to do it. And that played out. At the end of the war, 1783, a group of my officers, most of them who had not fought with me for very long, formed a attempt. They planned to either march on Congress and take it, overthrow the government, or abandon Congress for not having paid us for, several years at that point in time, or take the army, march to the frontier, and form an entirely separate government. And I found out about this. I walked into the room, and you all probably know about the end of that conversation, where I took my glasses on and talked about how I had grown old and gray in the service of my country and blind, etc. And the men all wept. What they missed is the first 2/3 of the speech, where I told them that if you do this, you're no soldiers of mine. That you have been bought by individuals who wish to provoke us to violence against the same system that we are trying to uphold. These ideals of English representative government, which we are still holding on to, that we believe that there should be some equality of all people, that we should have the access to self-determination in government. Those are the principles that we are holding to, that England rejected, that we still hold on to. But if you do this thing, you become the very thing that you hated so very much. So over my body will you do this? And then I went and I immediately resigned my commission to Annapolis. So for me, that is the action. We had to hold to those values that we were fighting for. And then it became the job of men like Mr. Henry to establish those systems in a positive way, to say what was working, what wasn't, what do we do moving forward. And my job was to make sure they had time to do it.
Now, you asked when we started to see or sense something. General Washington is a planter, a successful one. I wanted to be a planter. I was not successful. I was not successful as a shopkeeper. My father-in-law, the father of my late wife, Sarah, but we were young, married, we had a child at the time. Our house burned. I had no prospects. He employed me as a tavern keeper. So a tavern talk, I'm in. I'm here. I was not on the consumption side. I was on the serving side. And my father-in-law's tavern was right across the street from the Hanover County Courthouse. Now in Virginia, we had court days every month. They might call them public days. Court was in session. People would come from around about the county to attend the court sessions, to litigate matters, to be on trial for some offense that they had committed. Other people came and they transacted their own personal business. I would hear lawyers meeting with clients before court or after court, so I listened. I listened to everyday people, much like myself, chat with one another about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their desires. I studied human nature. And that's where you learn about what works and what does not work. So as we began to rebel against England, remember, we didn't move. Great Britain moved. We were not radicals. Believe it or not, we were conservatives. We simply wanted the Crown and Parliament to follow British law. If they had followed British law, we might still be part of the Commonwealth of British Nations today. They changed. We did not. We were eventually forced to take action. And as we have discussed earlier, as things moved and things deteriorated, people started making contributions to the greater good. They started seeing we have an option. For me, it was liberty or death. I made a statement about that in the Virginia Convention in March 1775. I presented my case against England and I made the declaration, give me liberty or give me death, and I meant it. Other people agreed with that, but we had to do something. And once we made the decision to put Virginia in a posture of active defense, the people who were conservative came over. Some remained conservative, but we decided we have to do this. We're going to fight for our survival. And that's where, good sir, we discovered a thing called our genius. We are capable of self-rule. We are demonstrating it. If we are not having help from our mother country, then we have the ability to create something ourselves, and we can model it on that wonderful system of British government. But we have just to make sure we know what the roles and the distinctions are, and to remind ourselves of our principles.
We woke up from our complacency and realized we were stronger than we thought we were. And that we could, in fact, create this system of government. We could, in fact, form something. We could, in fact, begin to work together. I mean, I watched it happen in the Army. We took a group of men who all, again, did not get along very, very well. I remember the first 6 months of the conflict when I first arrived in July of last year in 75. We had men from Massachusetts and Virginia begin fighting each other because they didn't like the cut of each other's jib. And it was started a snowball fight, turned into a brawl, and by the end of that conflict, 1,000 men were beating the ever-loving hell out of each other in Harbor Yard. The British, less than 500 yards away across Boston Harbor, they were more engaged in hating each other than they were actually fighting the British enemy. By the end of the conflict, we had a military force who all were operating to the point they were willing to go and overthrow their government and stand together as one because they created something. They found in each other a unity. A unity of purpose. Not that I'm saying that's the thing that should have happened, it should not have happened. But they had come to the point where no longer did they see themselves as men from Delaware or Virginia or Massachusetts. They saw themselves as Continental Army troops from those places, but they created a bond. So in conflict, we found this. And then internally in the states discovered this. And it was simply a matter of time until all of these different states, and this at that time Confederacy, would recognize that together, bound together in more than just concept and common language, we would have a strong unification. As the Army had done, so too could the states. And that is the positive to come from it.
And we also found an identity.
Yes.
We were elected by Virginia to serve in the first Continental Congress in September, October 1774. Thank you. I still appreciate your hospitality at Mount Vernon.
Most welcome.
But we arrived in Philadelphia, and we were going to discuss how to respond to the coercive acts, the intolerable acts. And what had happened to Massachusetts, we came to believe could happen to any colony.
Mhm.
So it was therefore imperative that we unite and act. And while we were there, immediately we saw differences. You know, some of the New England states and the southern states said, well, let's give a more proactive response. Some of the middle states said, maybe not so much. But and I did say this, I got tired of the bickering and no commitment. For some reason, I just opened my mouth and go with it.
It's a common pattern with Mr. Henry.
Yes, I don't know how to break it. I said, we are no longer New Englanders or Pennsylvanians or Marylanders. I am no longer a Virginian. I am an American. We gave ourselves an identity. Yeah, we gave ourselves an identity. And then, when it was all said and done, 13 rebel colonies looked down upon and despised by Great Britain. We have tamed the British lion. And I say good for us.
Well, you call yourself a conservative, but this idea of self-government sounds pretty radical.
Mm.
To me, it sounds pretty radical. It should have been pretty radical to you because there wasn't very many examples of that in existence as you're trying to put together a government fighting exams. So my question again is to you, as you're defining self-government, how did you see the relationship of the role of the government and the role of citizens in creating a new kind of government, self-government?
Well, as a lawyer, I believe you state the case. You're the jury, okay? You present the matter at hand. You cite what is in question. Then you present your case. You present evidence, facts. You make a logical, reasoned argument in order to convince the jury to come to the conclusion that you're seeking. So I'm going to ask, I think there are several questions here that lead us to this thing about forming a new government. Why do we have government? What is its purpose, its aim? Always called it the end. What form should it take to achieve that end? Then what internal structure is required to give life and substance to that form to achieve that end? And then once we have answered those questions, we can determine what role do we play individually. For me, the end of government is the security of our liberties. And a government is strong when it secures the liberties of the people and sets a condition for them to be able to pursue happiness. We agreed that a republic was the best form. And then we disagreed on some of the structure.
The principle of the republic was agreed upon. It's the system that went into it.
We all agreed we wanted to preserve the union.
Mhm.
We just had different views about
To me, along the lines of presenting to your point of what is the role of subjects, old habit side hard. What is the role of citizen in this new government, and what is the role of government towards the citizens? And Mr. Henry is absolutely correct. It is the idea that we must ensure that the people have a voice, that liberties are protected. That is the role of government. The question then becomes, what are those liberties? How do they exercise? Who has those liberties?
Right.
And then also how those operate. And then the structure of government all becomes part of it. So I will give you first and foremost my very uneducated perspective on the basic systems of government that we have to choose from. This will bring you back, I promise, to the point that you brought forward. It's so excellent. There are three basic tenets of government, as I understand it. And again, uneducated man here. There are many more options, but these are the general structures. There's monarchy, there's aristocracy, there's democracy. Those are the basic systems that exist. Monarchy is fairly obvious. One individual carries the right, whether it be divine right of a king or a queen or an emperor, it doesn't matter, but they carry the responsibility for their people. Talk about the father towards his children with the king. The expectation then is that system. Aristocracy is much more obvious, or less obvious, but complicated. A group of individuals, for some reason, in a superior position, ruling over those who are in an inferior position. And it depends on what that looks like. And then, of course, the third being democracy, which is power in the hands, fully in some cases, of the people. Now, each of these governments have their own problems. Each of them have their own positives. Monarchy, the most consistently stable form of government. Monarchies are endemic. They exist across time and empire, and they are consistently the most established and firm and easy to maintain. The problem is they're also the most predisposed to removing individuals' liberties. A king or a queen or an emperor who cares for his people and ensures their liberties and protection is a good king. A king or a queen or an emperor who takes away the liberties of their people is what? A tyrant. You will sense a pattern in them here. Now we've come to the second system. So we knew we did not wish to have a monarchy because we've just gotten away from one. And we saw that even though the parliamentary monarchy that existed, this representative monarchy, which had liberties for the people, if certain people were not treated properly by the monarch, they would be very easily reduced to an other's status. So we did not wish to maintain monarchy. What is the problem? What is the benefit of their aristocracy then? A republic, a true republic, like the Roman Republic, was an aristocracy, the Republicans of Rome. Now, the republic has significant benefits to it. Now, you may seem, what on earth is the significant benefit? It requires this question of responsibility and virtue. The idea that those in the position of power, those aristocrats, say Virginia, I would probably fall into that category. Not noble in my case, but whatever structure it is, their job is to care for those who are less fortunate than themselves, whatever that derivation may be. And an aristocrat is supposed to and expected in this system to what we call condescend. That sounds like a negative term. In our time, it's a positive one. To those who are inferior to make sure that their needs are met. And by doing so, demonstrate, though I am your better, I recognize and genuflect and do the best I can to overwork to ensure that you are properly cared for. Because I am in a better position, financially, experientially, circumstantially. Therefore, it is my job to ensure that you, less fortunate, are not ignored and cast aside. Look at medieval Europe. A lord and their peasants. The peasants cared for food, days off work, and in return they work for the lord, etc. But they are given a great deal of support from that crown. Varying successes. What happens when an aristocracy goes bad, however? It becomes an oligarchy. Oligarchy means the ruling of a handful of individuals doing things for their own financial self-interest at the expense of those who are in their care. What is that called? You're sensing a pattern here. So we know we do not wish to have a true aristocracy in this new system of government. So now we come to the third, democracy, the most egalitarian, the place where the most liberties are guaranteed to its subjects and citizens. The democracies, the imperfect democracies of Greece, as we discover, but the democracies, the idea that there is a great deal of individual liberty, not abject freedom, not as in a state of nature, to say, for example, I like your shirt very much, and if I'm stronger, I can take it. That is not liberty, that is freedom, and that causes a problem. So liberty says that you have a right to your shirt and I cannot simply take it because I like it more, right? So these liberties, you're very welcome. It's also very delightful. We'll talk about it later. But this democracy, there is a significant danger. It is the most consistently unstable form of government because they collapse like that. The other problem with democracy is that it is very, very easy for a majority of a very small number to lord over and destroy the liberties of the others that disagree with them. They're prone to faction. They are prone to vice. They are prone to selfishness because human beings are by nature very selfish. A democracy must require an incredibly educated public all working together in common cause even when they disagree with each other. That is the problem with democracy. Tyranny, there's that word again, of the majority. 51% with the power and influence to destroy the rights of 49. So we don't really want that either. But all three of these have positives. So eventually what we did in the Constitution, in effect, was combine all three of them. So let's do a bit of a thought experiment. Where do we see in this constitutional concept? I know Mr. Henry has thoughts about this, but he's not talking right now.
Give him a.
Where do you see aspects of monarchy in this new constitutional system?
Executive branch.
The executive branch, the presidency.
Say again, please.
The executive branch, the presidency. Aspects of monarchy.
Okay.
Aspects of monarchy. Their individual job, the executive, was to ensure proper handling of foreign affairs, making sure that alliances are controlled, making sure the states aren't working against each other, taking care of those individual things, making treaties, working in those capacities. That was the responsibility. And maintaining internal protections. That is all there. Where do you see aspects, this was a little more complicated, less complicated, of democracy in the constitutional government? Close. Part of Congress. The House of Representatives. The House who speaks on behalf of the people. A House based on per capita by the individuals from each state. A numeric number of those in Congress based upon the population of that particular colony. Rhode Island has less has less House of Representatives members. New York has more. Virginia had the most. Complications there, yes. Where do we see aristocracy? And the judiciary. Now, is it perfect? No. But by combining these aspects, we were hoping to check and balance themselves so that the judiciary could counter a tyrannical executive, and the executive could counter a majority of the representatives, and the representatives could counter the tyranny of the states. The Senate represents the states. The votes in the state were supposed to be directly tied to the Senate. Now, that is the way it was. I'm not saying it will stay that way. And there's a reason we say this, and this brings it to the next important point. In the first part of the Constitution, we put in this language, Mr. Madison did an excellent job with this. And it simply says, to your question, what is my perspective of how citizens and the government must respond to each other? What does the first part of the Constitution say? In order to create a more, don't forget the more, not a perfect union, a, which means there's still work to do. Which implies that the people who are elected individuals who are in government, who are serving at the behest of the people, must remember, as my good friend Mr. Henry says, that the Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. Rather, it is an instrument for the people to restrain their government. My perspective of the role of citizen and government is that the government serves on behalf of the people, but the people must educate themselves on what that relationship is so that they are able to properly engage in controlling and guiding their government. The only way this system works is if the people are educated in that system. What I mean by that is a sense of common shared sense of morality, meaning general right and wrong, a common sense of how to care for your individuals, the ability to have conversation with each other, the ability to avoid faction, the ability to avoid picking one side and sticking with it just because I'm this and not you're not that. Those things lead to populism. These questions are ingrained in this concept, but at the core it requires all of you, because really you're the ones we're talking about, to be willing to understand the system and care first and foremost for each other. Because no longer does the king dictate your actions, you dictate your actions. The king is no longer the father of you all, you are the parents of each other. That is the role of government and is to do.
And I maintain the role of government is to preserve the liberties of the people. And where we differed I did not attend that meeting in Philadelphia,
The Constitution.
where I think
The extra le-
56
extra
to
legal
60
one.
men locked the doors and took vows of secrecy. And then throughout the very government, they were sent there to revise. And then they replaced it. They replaced the Articles of Confederation. Yes, there were flaws and defects, but they could have been fixed. What they did instead was scrap that and then adopt a defective document. The general was kind enough to send me a copy of the draft.
I was going to say the law.
I did not attend that convention. I stayed at home. He sent me a copy of it and asked for my opinion. I wrote back to him and thanked him. I believe I was gracious, but I also said I cannot bring myself to support this. But I was elected as a delegate to the Virginia ratifying conventions, and I was not a supporter of that paper. That's what I called it, that paper.
You're very good.
It made promises. It did not offer any delivery. The first thing missing, no Bill of Rights. No Bill of Rights. My goodness, we just fought a war over rights. And we were going to replace the Articles of Confederation with this untried, untested document that guaranteed no liberties for the people, unspecified powers, particularly under the necessary and proper clause. And it diminished the role of the states. Those of us who were foes of the Constitution, we were called anti-federalist, a bit of name calling, but that we were opposed to it. We believe that the states serve as the best mechanism for handling our concerns, and this is where the citizen participation comes in, because if government works for you, where do you see it? You see it where you live. If it doesn't work, you see it. If it does work, you see it. If there is a benefit in it for you, and you recognize that, then you think, well, this is working, and we should probably keep it that way. We got to know our elected representatives. They knew us. They were part of us. We could go to them. They knew our concerns, our desires, our ambitions. Just as the Colonial Assembly did when it passed the Two-Penny Act. They knew what was going on and they helped us. But we were going to create a consolidated government. And it was going to be situated miles and miles away from its constituents. This government was going to be large. It was going to be expansive. It was going to have a standing army and a navy. And it squinted toward monarchy. And I argued, along with the other anti-federalists, that this government would, like I said, be large, expansive. It will be expensive. Now you'll pay taxes twice. We'll have an army that is subject to an executive who may or may not be a good man. And you cannot count on professions of patriotism to carry. Anybody can say, I am a patriot. You prove you're a patriot. And we cannot, and we all, the friends and the foes all agreed we needed virtue. We all agreed that human beings are flawed, capable of good and evil. We saw that with the protests. Some people were good, some were violent. We knew that we needed to create a balance between two extremes. Too much liberty, you have anarchy. Too little liberty, tyranny. How do we control passions and inclinations in a way that works? My opinion was, when you form that government, you state what the liberties are. You put them in writing. There was none of that in the Constitution. We had it in our Virginia Declaration of Rights. Our Virginia Declaration of Rights was formed and adopted in June 1776. We followed it with our Constitution. So we in Virginia, we had rights embedded in our governing document from the very beginning. It was a forethought, not an afterthought, not an exclusion. And I argue on the floor, said, why didn't you include the Bill of Rights? Did you leave it out because it would take up too much paper? And they said, no, you have rights. This government will see to it. We'll be large, we'll have a large population. And because we'll have this large population, there will be competing interests. And because they are competing interests, they will balance one another out. Yes. We said, no. Put it in writing. They adopt it now and will amend it later, and eventually my nemesis in the ratifying debates, Mr. Madison, agreed to do that because the vote was very close. In Virginia at first, I predicted the Constitution would fail. We were almost evenly divided. When it came down to the final vote, 89 in favor of the Constitution, 79 opposed. That is not a lopsided decision. So people had questions. And if you want something to work, you have to convince people as to what you're doing, why, how you're going to make it work, and then they need to understand what they get out of it. And it must be written in the language they understand. And in my opinion, much of the language was incomprehensible to the average person. Make it apply. I'm very much about, and I'm not a theorist. I am a practical man. Make it where I can understand it because I represented people who needed to understand. They needed to understand it with as much black and white as possible. They said, you put it in writing, if you guarantee their rights and you set up a structure that will balance out this government, then people will willingly participate because their interests will be protected. We call it self-love. Sometimes that's a negative thing in the church environment, but self-love, self-interest. If it's working for you, you want to keep it, you want to protect it. You want to be around others who feel the same way, and then you'll work to see that it stays in place. And that was my take on it, and that's where we took different paths.
Well, you, in speaking, you put two words together. And in the literature of the time available to us, there's a third word that comes together, third concept. The first one is virtue. You mentioned that. The second is morality. And you mentioned that. The word you didn't mention was religion. So I want to put in the back of your mind, when we come back to this question, how did you define virtue, morality, and religion? And how do you see the three related, not only to themselves, but to the vision of governance that you have? But before I get to that question, I'm just really interested in how you stay friends. I mean, this was a pretty, I'll say, visceral argument to counter argue.
Do we answer the virtue morality question first?
No.
You want us to do this?
This one first.
Friendship first.
Yeah, friendship first.
Well, I'm a man of virtue, morality, principle, therefore I'm a good no. Mr. Henry and I.
No improvement, sorry.
That's very good. I'm practically perfect in every way.
And he wears his uniform,
I
and
am.
looks dashing.
I am.
Let's not pull
What's
off.
not to love? Terrible teeth, but great humor at the table. Mr. Henry and I think we are a good reflection of this concept of we describe of faction not dividing, or a different opinion not giving way to faction. Mr. Henry and I, for most of our early careers before the revolution began, I think were in many cases, though not always in the same place, of a similar mind. And I think we share the similar mind of the importance of structure. Now, I will say, Mr. Henry, I think, is more of a man of the people than I was. I was a man of my men, my soldiers, but there was a different level of expectation that we both carried in our governments before the war started. I was in a different social circle than Mr. Henry was. And I think I looked at Mr. Henry as a younger, I wouldn't say brother, but I think it's a little bit too close, perhaps too far apart in age, but as a younger, maybe a cousin in some cases. To say, come along with us and let us do this new thing. He was very much a younger generation. I was of a different, older generation. So the way I approach problems, the way Mr. Henry approached problems are very, very distinct. Younger still was men like Mr. Jefferson, who I think perhaps operated in a different way, even more than the two of us, but closer to you than to myself. Men like George Mason and Thomas Jefferson, who were, Mason, yes, Jefferson not so much, just different ages. We shared similar ideas, and then we differed over the Constitution. And men like Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Mason, who, again, Mr. Mason, a good friend of mine for many years. Over this question of the Constitution, our friendship completely broke in pieces and shattered and was never restored, ever again. Mr. Jefferson and I deviated significantly during the early presidency, and over this question of federalism, anti-federalism, Democrat Republicanism, et cetera, et cetera. But Mr. Jefferson's case, he could not separate public from private. And so his private discrepancy moved into driving his public opinion. What Mr. Henry and I think, walked, even though we differed on this question of the Constitution, is one, we respected each other significantly. And two, we were able to recognize the importance of this question, which we'll come back to, this virtue idea, which is at the core of it. Montesquieu talks about it, and Mr. Henry in the original language, whereas I'm not familiar with it. This question of virtue is a care for your fellow humanity, effectively, as much as you care for yourself, in simple principle. Again, I'm a simple man. The idea that even if you disagree with someone in this idea of a constitutional republic, then it is my responsibility, even more so perhaps, to ensure that I'm defending the liberties of someone who I disagree with, than it is to even defend the liberties of someone I do agree with. Because if I start to castigate the liberties of someone who is different than myself in opinion, well, then I am automatically saying that they are not the same as I am I not? Mm-hmm. And if I can see them as other, well, then we're right back again in the British system, aren't we? Mm-hmm. So Mr. Henry and I think, are a good example of holding to these principles, that even though we disagree on something, and as you have heard, and you only scratched the surface of how vehemently we disagreed over the years, we maintain the recognition that just because we disagreed did not mean that the other person had any less value. What united us was our desire for a cause, our desire for the liberties of our people. Though we approached it differently, the same goal was desired. To the point that when my presidency was over, and I felt that we were deviating in our country, in Virginia in particular, from those principles of liberty and equality, I asked Mr. Henry, who I disagreed with on many things, to step again into public consciousness, to run again for political office, 1797? To step in, or it was a little later than that.
1799.
99 is right before.
Alien Sedition Act.
Exactly, thank you. It was a little 2 years early. But I asked him to step back into public life because I was concerned that people had lost sight of the unifying cause that brought different factions together. Henry and I think, are reflective of this desire that I left in my farewell address, which is to avoid political faction, avoid picking a side based upon in my case, one might argue, an arbitrary system of I am with this group because I decide to be here. And then eventually I begin to look at the other group as an existential threat to my own existence. And the moment you see someone as a threat to your existence, you are starting to be willing to do anything you can to make sure that they cannot threaten you any longer, even disenfranchising them of their liberties. It's a simple principle of it. And so then the other side does the exact same thing. And then both sides become ingrained, rather than what's good for the whole, they become ingrained in what's good for me and mine, as opposed to you and yours. And once that happens, it's over. So Mr. Henry and I think, are reflective of attempting to prevent that from occurring, recognizing that we are different in opinion, but we are not of a different faction. We are the same faction with different ideas, and he is not a threat to myself.
May I respond? As we move through the crisis within, as General Washington has said, we recognize the common values. We agreed to common principles. When we were at the Virginia Convention in Richmond in March 1775, and I stood up after being frustrated with no progress with the delegation and the convention there. I stood up and I recognized that the conservative people had their point of view. I didn't agree with them, but I respected them. They were patriotic, but I said, different men see the same subject in different lights. I listened to them, they listened to me. And then, a month later, Lexington and Concord. And then when Mr. Washington was appointed the commander of the Continental Army, may I share a personal story about an encounter we had? Please. As soon as he accepted his appointment, he came to me with tears in his eyes. And he said, Mr. Henry, I wish to tell you something now. I count from the time that I accept this command to be the beginning and the downfall of my reputation. I did not forget that, and I firmly believed that what happened to him would determine the fate of our country. And in early 1778, while he was in the field fighting for our freedoms, there was a plot to replace him. I received an anonymous letter from a so-called friend in Philadelphia who praised me. I didn't deserve that praise. Criticized General Washington, who did not deserve those criticisms. You wanted to know my opinion about replacing him as commander. I would have no part of it. I forwarded the letter to him immediately with a letter of my own. And I said, just came to me. I do not recognize the handwriting. I want you to be aware of this. And I'm shocked that a man would consider me his friend who did not consider me. And then I was Virginia's first governor. I served 3 consecutive terms and then I had to rotate out. So I was the governor during the first part of the war. We had frequent communication with one another. He would write and he would ask, how can I get supplies? How can you fight a war if you don't have an army? How can the army fight if it doesn't have clothing, if it doesn't have food, if it doesn't have weapons? He was begging to have an army that would do its work. And I tried to do what I could, but my hands were tied. Our legislature had more authority than the governor in our constitution because we did not want to risk another monarchy even on a state level. So I had a privy council. I had to take directions from them. And when they decided that it was more important to keep troops at home to defend our massive coastline or our frontier against the Indian lands, they made a choice to keep men here. And I was hard pressed to fill the quota of regiment soldiers needed to serve the nation. But we wrote back and forth about the need to keep going. And then we both recognized that there was a decline in virtue and people were not supporting things. And I even had officers who wrote to me, said, I'm trying to find supplies, but the population is indifferent or disaffected. So we had that. And we had been through all that together. And then with this crisis, this quasi-war with France, with President Adams in office, we had political factions that had arisen, led by Alexander Hamilton and Mr. Jefferson, and Mr. Madison. And they threatened to split our nation. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were all both intent on creating a strong national central government that supplanted states' rights, suddenly sang a different tune. Now they were about states' rights, and they authored resolutions. Mr. Jefferson doing one for Kentucky, Mr. Madison for Virginia, in which they declared that if a state did not like a federal law, it could simply ignore it. And that threatened a war. We had gone through too much together to let this fall apart. We were about preserving the Union, although we didn't take the same path to it. I came around to it. And you know what? I will have to admit, after being in operation for about 10 years, it wasn't half bad. But he wrote to me and asked me to come out of retirement. People, I'm tired, I'm old, I suffer from malaria. I have a family to feed. But when he told me what he needed, I couldn't resist my old commander. And I wrote to him and said that my children would be embarrassed to know that we were contemporaries. And that when you called on me, I refused to go my mile to help you. So I came out of retirement. I had a letter, our friend, Henry Lee, he was the one that got us to corresponding one another again, if you remember. He knew that there had been some distance between us. I was afraid that I had alienated this man I looked up to and still do. He had heard the same of me, vicious rumors mouthed by factions. It got us to write one another again, and it was like, oh, it's been so long. I'm glad we have restored this relationship. It has meant so much to me. And I'll say, and I'll need to shut up soon because people have to go home and go to bed, myself included. But I received a letter from Governor Lee not long ago, in which he made a remark about the American Revolution. And I responded to him, and this was after we established our communications again, thankfully. I told him that I believe the American Revolution was given to us by deity to move us beyond the ordinary cares and concerns of life. And I have ever prized that Providence gave me some hope. We have a constitution, we have a country that is working, but if there ever comes a time when our liberties are threatened, I will do whatever I can, as old and as feeble as I may be, to serve my country. And I mean it.
So will you take a couple minutes to talk about virtue and morality, religion, and how you saw the three related, and how they, the
I think Mr.
relationship?
Henry has unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally, he's a dastardly fellow,
Yeah.
connected all three of those in his last comments, which I can address, I think, fairly simply. Virtue I've already described to you. The idea of caring for your fellow individuals' rights and liberties is more important and equally as important to your own. In order to do that, you must share a common sense of morality, which is tied to this question of virtue, which is care for individuals, what is right, what is wrong. And I also recognize I grew up in a world where that was driven, in many cases, our sense of morality was driven by the Church of England. However, I would expand that, and I'm unlike some of my counterparts who, when they speak of religious freedom in the country, the idea of pursuing religion for the sake of conscience, many individuals who speak of religious freedom speak of freedom of the Christian religion. They're referring to individuals who are able to operate according to various denominational divisions, Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Methodist, Quaker, Moravian, etc. When I speak of religious freedom, especially in those contexts, I consistently am referencing the true freedom of religion. I've made references throughout my life, towards the end of my life, I should say, supporting the Jewish community in Providence, Rhode Island, for example. I make a comment to one of my overseers that I'm looking for a good carpenter. I don't care if they're Jew or Greek, or I don't care if they are free or enslaved. I don't care if they're Christian or Mohammedan, Islam, or atheistical. It doesn't matter to me. I just want a good carpenter. The man's personal belief does not matter to me. It matters that he's willing to do the work that is expected of him. I get a great deal of castigation from many individuals in Congress, probably why they wanted to replace me eventually, when we established a chaplaincy corps in 1775, and I allowed a universalist, effectively, a congregationalist, but he's a universalist from Rhode Island or Connecticut, excuse me, to be a member of, to be the chaplain to his regiment. Instead of each state determining who would be their chaplaincy according to the head of that church, whatever state church they decided upon, I said each regiment votes upon who they wish to have serve those individuals' needs, to share for their case of morality, to care for their eternal souls, all these pieces. And the accusation was made, well, universalists believe that there is no God, or there's no prime God, that they will do whatever you wish. And I said, what does it matter? If the regiment wishes him, he will have him. I invited him to dinner and I gave him a commission in public. No one tells me what to do. At least in a sphere of influence that is mine. And so consistently I have held these ideas of virtue and morality and this sense of religion are important, but I recognize that this religion is one that is effectively what it comes down for myself. And it will be simple. I do not speak publicly about my personal beliefs, and I will not do that now. You're welcome to try, but I won't answer you, or I'll be very cagey about it. It is the reason I think religion is described so often is religion requires a recognition of something greater than oneself. And the concept that we were approaching, it is a world where in order to recognize this idea that there is something more important than you, it means there's a cause. Now, if you could find that path through an atheistic perspective, then so be it. In our terms, an atheist is almost a dirty word. Someone would rather be called someone agnostical than someone an atheist. But there are those who believe in the law of nature as opposed to the law of nature's God. That is no quibble. That is the thing that exists. The Enlightenment debates this. Is there a divine force, or is nature its own divine force? It doesn't matter. But either way, it requires the belief in something greater. And if that something greater requires you to care for your fellow human, which we all are, then that is a combined sense of morality. And if we all recognize that humans are all equal, which the Declaration describes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are, which means humankind, are created equal. They are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes. These principles mean that before humankind was established, there were basic fundamental principles that existed. And you must recognize your fellow humanity. Otherwise, we are all simply beasts. So, religion, or at least the instruction of morality that comes from it, and I do not specify in this moment what that is, must then lead to this question of virtue. They are all tied together. So at the end of the day, we must recognize a power greater than ourselves, not a power, but a purpose greater than ourselves. We must recognize the importance of our fellow humans in that purpose, and we must do our best to protect those individuals because we are all equal in that sense. And so, in my mind, it's very difficult to create some system of government without some semblance of those things being together.
Well, some of the early inhabitants of our colonies, when they were established, came here for religious freedom.
Mhm.
They lived with covenants. We formed compacts, that sort of thing. I shared earlier that I am the product of two influences, the Church of England and dissenters, Presbyterians, albeit Christian. So I was raised with that in my home. For me personally, Christianity is important. I want for my children to understand and to inherit Christian devotion. And I believe the Bible is one of the greatest books ever written. But that's for me. When we drafted our Virginia Declaration of Rights, we listed 16 articles. Mr. Mason was the scribe, but I helped craft the 15th and 16th articles. And the last one does not mention religion per se, but it does say the duty we owe to our Creator is a matter of personal choice and conscience. And must be allowed to be expressed.
Free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience.
And when the war was over, everything had been devastated. And churches had existed prior to the war. They fell into decay. The Anglican Church, obviously in Virginia, was strong. But I saw the churches as vehicles for education, in morality, you know, personal excellence, in virtue. Because that was a known entity for providing education. Public schools had not yet developed. So I proposed an assessment in 1784 to generate tax that would pay the teachers of Christian religion so that they could learn principles of morality and citizenship. And it had widespread support. Even General Washington liked it. But Mr. Madison and Mr. Jefferson had different plans, and I was in the legislature at the time. It had moved through committee and was receiving favorable response. But then somehow I was elected governor again, and returned to the governor's palace, and that proposal for the assessment simply died. 2 years later, Mr. Jefferson saw the passage of the statutes for religious freedom, disenfranchising the Anglican Church. But I believe that the three pillars of our society are virtue, morality, and religion. If we adhere to them and those principles, we will be strong. And I said that in response to a letter from a friend named Archibald Blair, who was writing about the affairs in France with their revolution and their reign of terror and the rise of this thing called deism. People spread rumors that I was a deist.
And
I
myself.
don't know. I don't know how they got that. I told my daughter, no, this is not true. Some people say that, but this is not happening. And Mr. Blair, in his letter, referred to the youth of our nation. He said they have imbibed the poison. They have been born into liberty and know not from whence it came. We must educate our children, our grandchildren. We must educate ourselves. And for me, the Christian upbringing, the Ten Commandments, the miracles of Christ, the Sermon on the Mount. You said something about neighbor, love thy neighbor as thyself. Those are important. Now it's up to each of us to figure out how to do that. So, yes, religion, in addition to virtue.
And I think the beauty of what Mr. Henry has just described is, I think, reflective of what we've all described in this conversation. You have two men here who have similar opinions on these subjects, but differing in certain specifics. And then you have men like Mr. Madison and Mr. Jefferson who also had differing perspectives. And I think in this is a good reflection. We all approach these subjects and these conversations differently. But at the end of the day, we're also working towards a common goal. And that in many ways is the beauty of this idea, this experiment, as so many men have said, that we are able to combine different opinions, different perspectives, different paths, and still work together to common hope. For every Henry and every Washington, whether it be questions of morality, religion, or virtue, there is a Mason, a Jefferson, and Madison, or a Burr.
Well, I'd
Meet
like,
him right where he is, out in the cold, preferably somewhere else. But that principle is there.
now I would ask a question of you. I have only so many years left. You may have a great many. What do you want? why do you want it, and what would you do to have it? We have agreed that a Republican form of government is important, that virtue is important, that adherence to our principles are important. If you don't agree with that, and we had people who wanted to tear the nation apart, and I spoke at an election rally at Charlotte County Courthouse not long ago, and I laid out the concerns and said, I don't understand the details of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Men who are much wiser and smarter than me can do that. I opposed the adoption of the Constitution. I was in the minority. But it is our law. It is the rule of our land. No county in Virginia can overturn a law of Virginia. How can Virginia or Kentucky overturn the law of the country dictated by the Constitution? I said, don't go to rebellion unless you have no other choice. But make sure you have no other choice, because once you do, there's no turning back. And you can never replace our present government with a monarchy.
Well, thank you both. If you're okay, General and Mr. Henry, I'd like to ask if there's any questions in the audience.
Of course.
For either of these men. Sure.
I'll just make a comment. You were talking about what do we want? What kind of government are we wanting? And War, Peace, and Justice is sponsoring a talk October 22nd on sortition, which is a more democratic form of government. And the possibility, now that we're 250 years in, is the system working for us? Is it oligarchic or is it truly democratic? And so the whole issue of sortition is to sort of say, okay, is there another way that we can move forward? And we're at a good inflection. We turned 50 years in to say, okay, maybe it's time to try something a little different.
And that is the beauty of the system, that it can be altered and changed as needs the people.
Perhaps that's the problem with the system right now, that it can't be changed.
Exactly so. But the most important part is that's up to you. Well said, sir.
Yeah, it's your heritage. It's our heritage. We've done what we can for better and worse, and we're yours.
And we're both dead. So
We're just there.
I knew I was feeling tired, but I'm not sure.
Not dead yet.
But if you're only as old as you feel, then,
Anyone else? Please, question?
we've told you everything you needed to know about the early constitutional republic of the United States. Excellent.
Yes, sir.
Question, I think this is General Washington and General Dubick as well. You've heard a lot of fascinating things here, so I would appreciate that very much. What would you say are the keys to having people who don't have the benefit of education or experience that you have to follow you as generals, as leaders, even to the extent of putting their lives on the line to do that? How did you able to do that in good times and bad? But what's the key to having people follow you?
A leader is marked, the war lesson I learned in the 7 Years' War, a leader is made an officer. I will start there. An officer is marked by how they behave in the role once they have it, not by the fact that they have the role to begin with. I was born in a world where aristocracy was expected, where an officer was made because of who he was born to be, not because he was good at the job. And I learned in about, 47 seconds of my first conflict, that leadership has everything to do with how you behave in the role. It has nothing to do with the fact that you've got it. And over the course of in my case, my first war, 5 years of conflict, and unfortunately the loss of probably several hundreds, if not a couple thousand of lives, I learned that hard lesson, which a leader is expected to carry their people with them and consider their needs, even over and above my own if necessary. Which is true for a soldier. And it is also true in my mind for a leader in civil government. I must remember who I represent. And thereby, I must demonstrate to those individuals that I care for them. Now that means many things. Why did men follow me? I frankly don't know. There's times I don't think I would follow myself. But they did. And it was my job to make sure I stood there with them at every step of the way. Perhaps General Dubick can reflect more on the past, but in the moment, that's my circumstance. So,
So the funny is you asked the question, first word I wrote down was behavior.
I can't confirm.
Yeah.
The second says I'd like a chicken salad sandwich. But
Yeah. My swamp.
Oh.
But you hit every one of them I've written down. Leadership, especially in combat or times of trial, non-combat, leadership's a matter of example, matter of presence, a matter not of what you say, but what you do, and how you help those who are following you, how you give meaning to their sacrifice, how you are selfless with respect to yourself and give their worth more value than your own. And your dedication to the mission. Again, not what you say, but how you do it. Those things that at least 250 years later, reading about you, I think are all exhibited in one time or another. It does not require perfection at all. And it doesn't require pretending to be perfect. There's no reason to stand before someone who knows you have screwed up and say you didn't screw up. That's a diminishing of your stature as a leader, your moral position as a leader. Admitting mistakes and moving on to mistakes is part of the behavior, part of the example that builds trust and confidence in your leadership and trust and confidence in the group of men as a cohesive unit that you lead, the men and women. I'm sorry.
May I add something? Just
Sure.
listening to you and observing this. I see character.
Yeah.
Honor. You expressed both of those. And if you have those, then to me, you've got the makings of what is absolutely essential and required.
Matter of fact, character is the name of a book written by a good friend of mine, Stan McChrystal, General Stan McChrystal. I recommend it to you all. I don't get cut on it. Occasionally he buys me a beer, but that's about it. But it makes your point of character over and over again on the importance of character and leadership. So thank you.
That was a good question.
Anyone want to be the last question? Please, thank you, ma'am.
Well, I just find it fascinating that back then, people were by and large uneducated. They were farmers and they were laborers and they were sparsely, there were towns with a lot of people lived in the countryside. And I just find it amazing that so much information got to so many people. And I know there was a lot of disagreement and argument. Some people stood firmly for the crown and some people became, enamored with the Patriots right away. But it just today seems like we should be re-educating people about the Constitution.
They're interesting.
And teaching it again.
Oh, I understand. There's actually an interesting thing. There's a complexity of history, and for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to stop being George Washington for a second and be the real guy. I'm not George, by the way. Sorry. So you're actually striking something very, very important. Very, very important. The idea of education, right? And there's an interesting kind of linguistical trick. Now, what I'm about to say is a little complicated, but in the 18th century, they did not see themselves as uneducated in many cases. They were educated. The actual definition of education in the Oxford Dictionary, the Old English Dictionary, is you're educated according to the level of your means and expectation. So you're being taught. They didn't view education simply as scholastic endeavor. They viewed education as anything you did to help you survive, whether it be farming, whether it be blacksmithing, whether it be et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now,
I mean, people couldn't read.
that's actually a misunderstanding in many cases. In an agricultural society in Virginia, more people could read and write than people realized. The more, at the time, the more urban the environment, the lower the population's reading level was. Because you could go to your neighbor and have them read it for you.
Okay.
In an agricultural society, many people would have at least a basic rudimentary understanding of reading and writing because they had to sign contracts, make their name, etc. So now, are they reading to what we consider a reading level? Probably not. But they were still functionally, generally literate for the most part. Not everyone, but more people than you realized. In the 18th century, for example, it's not in Virginia, it's not illegal for an enslaved person to read and write. In fact, it's encouraged. So there's many enslaved people who actually have a lot of reading and writing compared to other counterparts. So it's not incorrect that there was a general lack of education for what we would consider today to be a consistent education. That is absolutely true. But in the 18th century, more folks had access to information than you realize. Part of the reason they met at church once a month is so that all the new political information would be read to you. So your people were having a newspaper brought to them every month, and all new laws were being read, all new questions were being brought forward, all the new articles. You go to Tavern so that you can have someone read a newspaper to you. So even though we were a very agricultural society, the level of access to information was significantly higher than most people in modern day realize. And again, not everyone was literate. That's absolutely not true. You're absolutely right on that. But it was a lot, there were more people who were functionally literate enough than we realize. Now, what they were not educated in was the complexity of government structures. So that was what we were talking about. When we talked about educating people, we mean how to teach them to go from being functionally literate. I can write my name, I can read a basic contract, I can move, to how to move them into an understanding of how to be educated members of our society. And let's be perfectly candid, from then to now, that's been the biggest thing we've struggled with from the beginning. So when you say we need to go back to teaching those things, you're not wrong, but we struggled to teach them from the beginning. So it's a good point, it's a very good point. And education in those pieces is a thing. Now this is not as George Washington, this is as Daniel. When I look at the literacy rates that we see across the country, it doesn't matter what state you're in, urban, suburban, agricultural or not, and people are reading it sometimes at the second, third grade level. It's not their fault that those young people aren't being taught properly. That's on us.
I would say also that in this period, the explosion of newspapers is exponential. And the copyright laws allowed you to take whatever was printed somewhere else and print it yourself. So the spread of information was very fast comparatively. Now, not as fast as social media, you go on your phone, but very fast relative to the age. And so a lot of these revolutionary ideas, these contrary opinions about, were a matter of public access in a very quick access as well. No, not between Lord Cornwallis or the Howe brothers in London. That was another matter. But inside the United States, the information flowed remarkably fast.
But your point is well taken. That education is what got us where we were, and that's what continued us for these last 250 years. And if we wish to go another 250 years, it's going to require us to continue those things. And like you said, sir, question these pieces. You know, Jefferson talks about this a lot. I'm not a fan of Jefferson in a lot of cases, but he has an interesting concept because it's not his idea. It's the early American system. It's the early British system. Is every time they passed a law, not in the early American system, the early British system, for the most part, laws were temporary. Taxes were temporary. You would have sunsets of the law would go for a period of time and then it would end. And if you want to reinstitute the law, you had to go back to that law and deal with it. And then they had like a thing where if you didn't pass it, then it would kind of revert to its old status until you dealt with it again. But Jefferson talks about the idea of even sunsetting the Constitution. Not saying that's the right course of action or the wrong course of action, but they have these conversations of should laws end every generation so that the new generation can establish laws for themselves to continue moving these forward. So these are all conversations that happened then, they're going to happen now, and they probably should happen because that in conversations where we find a path forward. So.
Oh, so I thought I had the last question. Oh, your hand's up. Be careful, I'm a teacher.
You're waving your hand, you
You're
have
moving
to
your
ask.
hand. You're
Just saying hello.
Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all very
Thank you
much.
very much for your questions.
I want to thank our three patriots up here. Keith Shrum as Patrick Henry. Daniel Cross as George Washington. I have to say this, Daniel Cross was the former Colonel George Washington at Colonial Williamsburg. And you can see Daniel again at Mount Vernon. He's the manager of the military encampment. And I'm sure he will grow into the senior George Washington one day. And of course, Jim Dubick is Dan
Jim
Dubick. I would like to say that Patrick Kennedy, thank you for fighting for the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And they are over in that wall when you come back to visit. George Washington, whatever you did when you were the president of the Constitutional Convention, your leadership, however you shepherded those delegates to one of the second great document of this nation. So I thank you for that. And of course, our third patriot, Jim Dubick, who has served again on active duty for 37 years. And the question was wonderful. The great start is that little booklet. I'm not trying to push that little booklet, but it's a great point of departure to learn more about our form of government, especially about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And on the back wall, there's a quote there, and it was the wife of the mayor of Philadelphia on September 17th, 1787, when the U.S. Constitution was signed by the delegates. She asked Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought? Madame, a republic if you can keep it. No wiser words from such a great man. And the last thing I'll say, General Jim Dubick, we talked about this paper that Patrick Henry mentioned without the Bill of Rights. Well, for those of you who are not veterans or never served, I mentioned General Dubick has served in every unit from a platoon to a corps level. But every time you're promoted in the U.S. military, you retake the oath of office. And it's an oath that you will support and defend the Constitution against all foreign enemies, foreign and domestic. And so you're willing to put your life on the line, sacrifice your life for this piece of paper, which is a great document. So I'll encourage you to reacquaint yourselves with it. And the Declaration of Independence, especially during this year, it is so important, and during this time of this nation. You're all welcome back to come during normal operating hours to see these great exhibits here for the nation's 250th. And I invite you back. And again, I thank our host, the Cumberland County Historical Society, for hosting this event, and many others you do. It's a wonderful institution. So thank you, safe travels, enjoy the 4th, have a wonderful 4th of July tomorrow. Enjoy the fireworks.